everyone, and welcome to Book It. I'm Carol Ann Riddell. Joining us today is best-selling author Frederick Joseph. He's also a philanthropist, marketing expert, and a CUNY grad. So we have got lots to talk about. Fred, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
So your latest book is a collection of poetry. It is called We Alive, Beloved. It's your debut collection of poetry, I should add.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. I read the whole thing in one sitting.
Really?
I sure did, yes, absolutely. You cover a lot of topics in your poems, from racism to relationships to your dog.
Right, right.
What made you turn to poetry for this book? How did that come about?
So it's interesting. I don't know if I necessarily turned to poetry. I think that poetry's always been sort of the pillar of my work, right? There's a certain lyricism in prose I try to bring to essays and even like posts on social media, because I started out as a poet, right? My grandmother taught me how to write, and it's a funny story. I was listening to rap as a kid, as kids do, and she's like, oh, you know, this is poetry, and you know, me being 8 years old, I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about, you know? And so she's like, no, like listen to the cadence, listen to the lyrics. And so she introduced me to Langston Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks. And I'm like, this is kind of cool, right? So I started writing poetry very young, about 9 years old. So I always knew at some point I wanted to publish a collection. I just didn't know I would ever get to actually do it.
Yeah, and I read somewhere you said that poetry was the gift that your grandmother gave you.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Poetry is, my grandmother gave me the gift of word. You know, that is the magic that was her, the ability to not just craft a sentence, but to sort of have a vision of how I sort of try to string things together to make certain things happen.
One of the poems in the book has gotten a lot of attention, including national attention. It is called We Cry Together. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so We Cry Together was sort of my reflection on finding out that my wife had miscarried. I wanted to honor that for all the families and people who have been through that, and sit in that moment a bit, right? Because I do think that the trials and tribulations of trying to become parents don't necessarily get talked about enough, and that is such a heartbreak. And obviously we have poems about heartbreak in various capacities, but I don't know that we have that as much, especially from a man's point of view, right? I really wanted to sort of lean into the tenderness and the humanity to help also like dismantle, toxic masculinity a little bit, right? Where it's okay to be devastated, right? And to honor that devastation, whether in word or tears or music or, whatever you're feeling at the time. So, that's what that poem was.
And we'd love to have you read it for us, if you would.
Yeah,
Fred.
absolutely. From the hallway, I hear her sobbing, an ocean devouring her smile. My knuckles meet the steel door of a sterile hospital room, attempting to punch away our misfortune until I can replace it with something she actually deserves. From all of the IVF shots, the nights we debated over names, the anxiety attacks about money, and the moments we pinched ourselves at the idea of being chosen by Sadiq Joseph. How do you stitch a wound living in the syllables of a name never called? There is nothing to say when spun into a vortex of unspeakable loss. We spend weeks huddled around grief like a campfire, telling silent ghost stories about the people we stopped being just days before. Nurturing a flame so small it could be mistaken for hope. In the most somber hours when the world took its deepest breath, I sat beside her, staring at the slight crescent of her unhoused belly. For so long, I swore I heard a heartbeat, but it was actually planets collapsing in the cavities of my chest. And I wondered, how are we going to survive this? And in time, my question was answered. Together.
It's so moving. It's so visceral.
Thank you.
Really, it's beautifully done.
I appreciate that.
I have to ask, how are you and your wife doing now? Because I know it's such a heartbreak.
So this was now 2 years ago. Time is interesting. Time does heal. but you're never not sitting with things like that, right? And I think so much is happening in society, in our personal lives, that if I'm transparent, it sort of feels like a place that you sit somewhere and you go back to it occasionally.
Sure.
And you move on to the other things that you're trying to tackle, but it doesn't dissipate. We just, you hear something or see something, you'll go there for a moment and then you'll close that door and you'll come back at some point.
I think loss is like that.
Yeah, yeah.
I read something you said, Fred. You said that these poems reveal pieces of your soul.
Yeah.
And that struck me because I wondered, was it intimidating or a little scary to be that personal on the page, at least at first?
Yeah, my first book was about my experiences with racism as a 13-year-old and whatnot. So I think that was the most vulnerable I had ever been. I kind of out the gate jumped right into vulnerability, but this was a different level for me, right? This was not, this wasn't a book that was trying to help people be better or,
Yes.
Things of that nature. It was just me. And, I felt bare at points, especially when you're reading in front of, I've done events at Lincoln Center and things like that. And, you're like, oh, there's 300 people here reading about, me and my mom or me and my wife. And yeah, but it's a beautiful thing because you can see in people's eyes that they relate.
That they connect, right?
Right, and you feel less alone for that.
So, Fred, you mentioned your first book. We mentioned before that you've written a number of books. The first book was The Black Friend on Being a Better White Person. It's described as a young adult book, although it seems to me that it's a book for every age.
I agree.
And you've said that you wrote the book, or you realized you needed to write the book after something that happened on the subway.
Yes, I was actually on the subway. This was probably 2018, and it's not much different from the things that happen on a regular basis, sadly. I was sitting down, and this woman, as I'm sitting there, she just and I'm in a full suit heading to the office. This is when I worked in marketing still. She had a purse, and first she tucked her purse away from me, and then she looked at me, and I put my headphones on, I'm listening to music, and there was a seat on the whole other side of the train. She looks at me and just gets up and is shaking and moves at the idea of me as a black person sitting next to this, white woman frightened her beyond belief. And so I remember posting about it on Twitter because, Twitter at the time was the town square. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this racism. And you had thousands of black and brown people who were like, yeah, I hate when that happens, and it happens to me constantly, so on and so forth. And thousands of white people saying, how is that racist? What was racist about this? I don't get it. What are you talking about? And I'm like, oh my God, yeah, we're having conversations about systems and history and, sort of institutional racism, but interpersonal racism and how we show up for our neighbors and on our daily basis, we're not really talking about that, right?
Yes.
And so I was like,
it's such a good point.
Right. And I was just, I'll do it, I'll do it, but especially because by the time we get to a certain age, sadly, people stop listening as much, right? So I'm like, if I can reach that woman on the train when she's 12 or 13 years old, maybe this doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And one of the things you say in the book is that there are two sayings that pretty much every person of color hears at some point, and they are, why does everything have to be about race, and I don't see color? And you argue very effectively in the book as to why those concepts, those sayings, are very much part of the problem.
Right.
I agree with you.
Right.
But tell us a little bit more in detail why.
I mean, the reality of it is when people say something like, I don't see race, race is one of the pillars of this nation, right? Race is one of the pillars of most societies. And to say that you don't see race doesn't absolve anyone but yourself of the things happening in relation to race, right? Mm-hmm. It'd be no different than right now if you said, I don't feel comfortable jogging in Central Park at night. And I'm like, well, I don't see sex, and therefore I don't understand what you're saying, right? I have to better show up for you as a friend, if I'm trying to be an ally or accomplice to women, understand why it is that you might feel unsafe. Because if I can understand that, then I can help facilitate a potential world where you don't have to feel that way. Mm-hmm. But if I refuse to see it, the only person I'm helping is myself. You still have the same issue, right? Yes. And then as far as the, why does everything have to be about race? I mean, it's a simple answer because everything is sadly about race, right? Race was created so that everything could be about race. The concept of race is actually a fairly new concept in history, right? Race was actually literally created to delineate who is and who isn't human at first, right? And who's worth and isn't worth being owned or, having property and able to vote and things of this nature. And so to try to suddenly snap your finger and say that this isn't—
It doesn't exist.
Exactly, that our society isn't based on this, again, it doesn't benefit anyone but you, right? To have the honest conversations and lean into the uncomfortability of the realities of our world is how we actually begin to change our world.
Yep. And The Black Friend became a bestseller.
Yeah, The Black Friend became an instant New York Times bestseller, out the gate.
Exciting.
Yeah.
So I want to switch gears for a moment because we should mention that you are part of our CUNY family.
Yes.
You are a Hunter grad. So how did those years influence your work, your writing?
Yeah, so it's so funny. So I'm a Hunter grad. I was actually on Hunter's student government for a while. Yeah. And I actually was a night school kid. I worked during the day, and so I was in my 20s going to school at night. And I actually felt like it influenced my time there in a beautiful way because I got to really appreciate being at Hunter. I wasn't just sort of zipping through and being young. I was like in classes with people who were in their 40s and 50s, and I'm 20, 19, and the perspective that I'm getting is just wonderful. And I think it actually influenced my writing a great deal because it helped teach me to slow down. Right?
Yeah.
I think when you're young, not everyone's the same, but a lot of people when you're young, everything is, I got to get to this, I got to do that, I want to do this, fast, and then—
We're all trying to grow up so quickly, right? And then you grow up and you're thinking—
Right, and if you do it right, the older you get, the more pensive you become, right? And so spending time in class, especially, I study political science, so we're in classes ruminating on the big issues of the world and our, our society, and the person next to me is 50 years old and I'm 20, and we're just in conversation about everything.
Yeah.
So a lot of my writing, I think, especially early on, may have been a bit advanced for my age, right? As I wasn't writing about sort of like, hanging out and, things like that. I was like, so the world and,
So speaking of writing, what is next for you? You have another book coming out.
Yeah. And so knowing I was going to be here on CUNY TV, and I haven't even done a cover reveal for this yet.
Okay, big moment, everybody.
Yeah. So I brought you a copy of my—
Pass it over to you.
Yes. So this is my debut YA novel, This Thing of Ours. And it's a pretty timely book in that it actually is centered around book bans. So it is a narrative that focuses on 3 young students in a writing program, and they're trying to use their ability on the page and the platform of the main character, who's a former athlete, to combat book bans, combat curriculum bans, and help save one of their teachers who's sort of like under fire because of the culture wars, if you would.
All right, very interesting. Well, I look forward to that one.
Absolutely.
So one other aspect of your career I want to touch on. So you're also a marketing expert. You were in Forbes 30 Under 30, right? For marketing and advertising. This is 2019, do I have that right? But you also sort of famously started the Black Panther Challenge.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about that quickly?
Yeah, so the Black Panther Challenge was this effort to take children who didn't necessarily have the resources to see Black Panther in movie theaters to see the film, right?
Yeah.
It was a simple concept, and it came out of this moment with my younger brother, who's significantly older now, but he was at the time, I believe, 7 or 8 years old, and he saw the trailer for Black Panther, and he's just like enamored. And
Yeah.
like, okay.
We are home. My son, it is your time.
I'll obviously take him to see it, but I thought about, what about the kids who aren't able to see it?
Can't go, right.
And so, I just decided to use some of my marketing muscle to create a GoFundMe campaign, and reached out to— I was probably very annoying. I was on Twitter reaching out to Chelsea Clinton and all these famous people, and it gained some traction, a little notoriety, and then one night I wake up and they're like, hey, so Chelsea Clinton shared it along with a few other celebrities, and it is literally everywhere now. So it actually became the largest GoFundMe in history based on the amount of campaigns that are created globally. So what started out trying to take 100 kids to see the film, we ended up taking 700,000 around the world to see Black Panther for free.
It's just remarkable.
Yeah.
Wow. And you ended up on the Ellen DeGeneres show. I mean, it was
Yeah.
it really just blew up.
You know that I recently tweeted out a GoFundMe page that was started as a way to take deserving kids to see the upcoming movie Black Panther, and the response has been amazing. The guy who started it all is in our audience today. He has no idea I'm about to call him down. Frederick Joseph, where are you? And come on down.
Yeah, it absolutely blew up, and I think it sort of launched my career because, you know, I always have to speak his name in any room that I'm in. Chadwick Boseman reached out to me as this was all happening, you know, the late dear Chadwick Boseman, and asked me, well, you know, besides, you know, this and, you know, community organizing, what do you do? I'm like, well, you know, like at that point, you're like, the Black Panther's asking you what you do. So I'm like, well, I'm a writer. I write on the side, and I hadn't been published or anything like that. He's like, okay, send me something. I was like, okay. Next thing I know, HuffPo had reached out, hey, you want to write about, you know, representation? And then things kind of snowballed from there.
That's really exciting.
Yeah.
That's really good. See, a lot of a good deed as well.
Right.
Fred, I'd like to end with another one of your poems, if you would read it. I just was so moved by the poem that you wrote for your wife. It's called In Another Life.
Yes. When my pulse fades, I'll chase the silhouette of you swaying to music, knowing our song is next to play. And if I can no longer see or hear, I'll follow the scent of your perfume, knowing the sweetness of your skin. Through the doors where time is hushed, I'll search for the trail of your laughter, tracing it back to the moment we met, when I first held the horizon line of your hands, rested in the sanctuary of your voice. When my breath grows thin, find me waiting for you on a street, lined with magnolias, unchanged in essence, and yet new. You'll know it's me as you walk closer. Listen for the sound of my heart skipping a beat.
That is just lovely. It just choked me up. It's really, I have to ask, did she just love it?
She's, I don't think she's to this day sort of used to sort of the public side of things. So she loves it, but the fact that occasionally I've had to read it to her in front of like hundreds of people.
Yes.
Yeah. She loves it.
It's a moment. It's a moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Fred, thank you so much for all this time. Gosh, it was such a pleasure.
Thank you for
to be
having
able
me.
to chat with you.
Thank you.
Next, let's head to our podcast studio to see what Isabel Ortiz has for us in Breaking Books.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Breaking Books. I'm Isabel Ortiz, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by entrepreneur and author Jamie Sid to discuss her short story, The World in a Box. Hi Jamie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Isabel. It's such a pleasure.
I am super excited to have you today because this book really was a mind-opening experience for me, and I'm sure that is what you aimed for in writing this book.
Yes.
Just because I think the concept truly was beautiful, I think because it can open minds of anybody, any age. So I really would appreciate if you can tell us a little bit about the book.
Sure. So originally I wrote the book while living in the city. I was living in Midtown, and I literally was overlooking my apartment window and looking at the Empire State Building and looking at all the boxes. And it suddenly occurred to me that people come and go. And sometimes people stay for a long time and people go. And how we embrace change and how the city is always constantly changing, right? And that's how the whole creative process started with this story. But also how sometimes we battle change, and how sometimes it's so difficult to embrace it because we overthink it.
When you first open the book, you hear about this old man who thinks his perfect little box is good enough, bright enough. It's just his piece of perfection. So was there a reason that you decided to pick an old man to kind of be the protagonist somewhat in this book?
You know, it's so funny you asked me that, because at one point I was like, should I make it an old woman? But it really just came as an old man. It came as this this image of, this just image, and it was pretty a universal image. I think it just sounded good when I said, okay, the old man. It's like the old man and the fish and the whale and the, and that image of that protagonist. Because really, as we get older, we tend to overthink. We tend to be somewhat rigid, and I think that when we think of rigidity and when we think of like constant like groundness, we think of this image of a more mature person, a more, individual that's been around a long time and questions like, hey, I'm really great. Why isn't everybody like, wanting to stay with me for so long? Mm-hmm. And that's really what was, the inspiration behind it and why.
So I wanted to know for you, because the old man talks about this idea of perfection in the book, and you see that in the first kind of illustration, which I thought was really nice, because you put it's the box and then it's perfect in a whole bunch of different languages. Is perfection this idea, when you were writing it, was perfection this idea that you could imagine, or was it something that you meant to have in the book that felt unattainable?
No, I think perfection was something that you could imagine. And it is almost unattainable, because perfection is really whatever version you think perfect is, right? And that's why there are all the different languages and the different ways to say perfect, because imperfection is perfection, right? And that's why that exists. And really, the illustrator, Alicia, did a beautiful job in translating that initial message of the book and creating that image of the perfect, imperfect box.
And I wonder, too, how that journey really went for you, because you have these words, you have this beautiful story, but then you have to have the illustrations to match that. So what was your journey like of finding an illustrator where you felt that your words and their images of the book kind of came together and blended well?
That was a process because I didn't want traditional illustrations. I'd spoken to many illustrators and had many samples, and all of them, they were looking at it from a non-abstract way, and I wanted abstract. I wanted something different to be able to depict the story in an image that wasn't perfect to the story either, right? And it really showed a unique way of depicting the story in an image. And that's what it was. So the process was a long process, because it literally almost took me 2 years.
It's probably so nice when it's like a blending of the minds.
It was. And also for me, from the I respect artists, musicians, and anyone who really has a non-conventional way of, creating something. And that's their way of contributing to the world. And this was my way of collaborating with an artist who I feel had so much talent and has so much talent, and a way that I felt like, hey, this could be a wonderful way for artists and writers to collaborate, because writers are we constantly write. There's always there's a story in my head all the time. Like, I probably have 3, 4, 5 books in this brain, right? But, but I think that when you come together, it just creates a different blend. And I think working together really creates a better story. It creates a better energy. And it really just shows how collaboration can empower both an artist and a writer to get their work out there.
And you really do see, like, your culture, the illustrator's culture really combined in this book. Because I know you have traveled extensively. Did any of your travels and kind of maybe the practices or the philosophies you picked up during your time traveling really help inspire this book?
So it's so funny, because intentionally, no way. Unintentionally, depending on what you see and what you don't, you can pick up certain undertones, right? But like, for example, traveling throughout Asia, there are various different ways of life, right? Hinduism is a way of life. Buddhism is a way of life, right? All of those little things and these practices to really get you to just live life in a way that's kind of like embracing it and flowing with the water and flowing with life. And I think that somehow that is combined in the book. And it was not an intentional thing to do, I feel like the story is my Western way of doing things sometimes. And then the images actually bring about that like an ancient way of like, there's elements of it that have like a modern abstract art, you know, depiction. And then there's an element of it that has like an older traditional artsy kind of look and feel.
And I guess one final thing, what message do you want people to take away from reading The World in a Box?
Embrace life. Embrace life with loving and beautiful eyes.
Well, that is a beautiful thing to end this off on, but thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you.
It was a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And now it's time for Uncensored. Author and columnist Linda Stacey is back, and as always, she has plenty to say about what she's reading.
What do you call the #1 thriller writer in the United States who beats out the likes of James Patterson and John Grisham? You call her Doctor. That's what. I'm talking about Freida McFadden, or the writer whose pen name is Freida McFadden, but whose patients know her by her real name, which, by the way, she's careful to keep a secret. She is a brain injury doctor by training and an author by choice. Well, not just any author, but one who's sold 10 million books. What makes McFadden even more astonishing is that not only has she done the impossible by crossing over from medicine to fiction, but she did it by self-publishing. Nobody can do that. I just finished McFadden's The Boyfriend, a mystery thriller about a 34-year-old woman and her 2 girlfriends looking for love in New York City. Think of it as a kind of Sex and the City, but with a serial killer. Sydney Shaw, like many singles in the city, meets most of her dates on a dating app. But the guys she and her friends meet usually lie about their looks, their jobs, their single status. They stick them with the checks and are colossal bores who find themselves incredibly interesting. After one of her dates assaults her, Sydney is rescued by a passerby, the world's handsomest man, a doctor no less. Eventually, they meet up by accident again, but it's after one of her 2 friends has been brutally murdered. The perfect man can't be the killer, can he? It can't be the super, can it? It can't be the creepy date. Well, maybe. On another note entirely, we all know Shakespeare and we all know Hamlet. But did you know that the Bard of Avon had a wife and children, one of whom was a boy named Hamnet, with an N, not an L? Hamnet died young, and that's about all we know about him. But in the hands of author Maggie O'Farrell, Hamnet, the novel and the child, are brought to life. O'Farrell imagined Shakespeare's marriage to a psychically gifted woman named Agnes. They have a very sensual bond until the son dies from Black Plague. Of course, in real life, Shakespeare never mentioned the plague ever, and only 1 or 2 people in the town of this novel seem to even have it. Well, I kind of flew through the book. It was probably because I kept looking for more, but I didn't ever really get it. And then, like too many modern novels, it just ends. As a novelist myself, I think this is kind of a cheat. I mean, call me old school, but I still love a rip-roaring good tale with, yes, a beginning, a middle, and an end, not just a middle. It's kind of like eating the inside of a pie without the gooey bottom and the top crust that seals it all up. For Uncensored, I'm Linda Stacey.
That wraps up another chapter for us. Thanks so much for watching. A quick reminder to check us out on our new CUNY TV app and on social media. We'd love to hear from you. I'm Carol Ann Riddell. See you next time on Book It.